Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Okay, so we're going to continue on the distortions today. And so last time we ended with the mental filtering and discounting the positive. You even touched a little bit on the discounting the negative. Maybe you'll want to say something about that. But we're going to continue with other cognitive distortions. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, that's great. Just one more example of discounting the negative. We often do that when we're criticized. That would be the positive distortion.
Right.
Is discounting the negative. And so let's say you're criticized. There's a human tendency to argue, to defend yourself, and to discount the validity of what the other person.
Right, it's pretty automatic.
Yeah, and that would be a positive distortion.
Uh-huh.
That's almost universal, and that one also gets us into trouble in terms of triggering relationship conflicts.
And you don't have to be a narcissist to discount the criticisms.
No, we all have that tendency. And by the way, that tendency to get defensive when criticized results often, too, from overgeneralizations that we're making. So we say if somebody criticizes my teaching or criticizes my this or that, they're criticizing me as a human being rather than thinking of it as something specific, which is always so much easier to deal with. But we think that our whole identity or our whole worthwhileness is on the line, and that triggers tremendous pain.
Yeah, we take it as a personal attack rather than just a specific comment about one particular behavior.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll go on today to focus on 3 or 4 more of the negative distortions and maybe give some positive examples.
All right.
We'll do jumping to conclusions, is one, magnification and minimization is a second, emotional reasoning is a third we'll focus on, and labeling.
Okay.
So starting with jumping to conclusions, it's where you jump to conclusions that aren't necessarily justified by the facts of the situation, and the 2 most common forms are mind reading. That's when you assume what other people are thinking and feeling, and especially what they're thinking and feeling about you. And fortune telling is when you make unwarranted negative predictions about the future.
So let's look at mind reading.
Yeah, mind reading. We often, mind reading is extremely common in social anxiety and shyness, as well as public speaking anxiety.
Right.
The shy person in a group, you'll be telling yourself, "Oh, this person isn't really interested in me. These people wouldn't be interested in what I have to say. They're not anxious. I'm the only one who's feeling this way," and that creates intense insecurity and awkwardness and loneliness, as well as shyness. But mind reading can have other consequences too. I remember that I was eating in a Mexican restaurant in New York City after I gave a talk, and I was there alone because I just made the trip up to New York by myself, and I was thinking that this waiter, he's probably kind of not going to give me very good service because I'm single. I just had that idea. I'm not.
Right. You just made it up on the spot.
Yeah. There's all these couples there, and sure enough, this couple was seated at the table right next to me, and they came out about 5 minutes after me, and I had ordered this thing called ceviche or something.
Ceviche, yeah.
Ceviche, some salad turns out it's a raw fish salad. I didn't realize that when I ordered it. And, so I had nibbled at it, and I said, hey, this is not for me. I'm going to wait for the other stuff I ordered.
Okay.
And then meanwhile, this couple ordered, and then they got served, and they were halfway through this their meal, and I started getting fuming with irritation. And so I finally said to the waiter in this kind of irate voice, I noticed they came in after me and they've been served, 15 minutes ago.
Yeah.
And he says, oh, I've been waiting for you to finish your salad. So he was being real polite. And it's just so interesting how we often think other people make us angry, but it's really our thoughts
yes,
create
exactly.
our emotions. Another one, I did a workshop in Ohio. Again, I don't know if I mentioned this in a previous podcast, but I about the feedback I got and how upset and ashamed I was. Well, I was going from city to city. I think it was one day workshop in each of several cities, and they arranged a driver to drive me from, I think, Cleveland to Dayton.
Okay.
And I always get feedback at the end of a workshop, and I forced myself to read it and to see what people said and to look at the ratings. And I just had the perception that this workshop was really, really a bad one. Not like horribly bad, because...
Did you feel like it was poorly received?
Poorly received, and that I'd made a lot of errors and that it hadn't gone very well. I was kind of ashamed. And I was in the front seat with this young guy who was driving me to the next city, and I said, well, David, now you've got to force yourself to look at the ratings. And I was saying, but I don't want to. And I was, just you have to do this. And so I started looking at them, sorting them, but I kind of tilted them because I was afraid the driver would see them, see how bad they were.
Like he cared, right?
Yeah. And then I tallied them up and did a little data on the numerical rating, the satisfaction with the rating, and it was 4.9, and it was the fourth highest workshop I've had in 35 years.
Wow.
And it was, I concluded that they must have incredibly low standards in Cleveland. But again, I was just reasoning, from myself about how other people were thinking and feeling. And so it's a real common distortion. The other one is fortune telling. That's where you make a negative prediction about the future that's not necessarily warranted. Now, fortune telling is
like we know the future.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like or some kind of a fortune teller. And this is actually the cause of all anxiety. A human being cannot experience anxiety without the fortune telling error. And in an anxiety, what you're doing, you're predicting that something terrible is about to happen. When I get on that airplane, it's gonna crash. When I give my talk, I'm gonna make a fool of myself, and people are gonna be looking down on me and judging me. That's more mind reading, also.
But it's mind reading in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And then panic attacks, when people get panicky, they're telling themselves, oh, I'm about to die, I'm going to have a heart attack and die, or I'm about to go crazy. If you've never experienced a panic attack, that probably doesn't mean much to you, but if you have, you know exactly what I'm saying, and people just freak out because they give themselves this unrealistic
it's never happened to me, but I've had a number of clients who've been in that situation.
Oh,
so, yeah.
And then in depression, the fortune telling triggers hopelessness, a feeling of hopelessness. You tell yourself you'll never get better, your problems can never be solved, and it just seems so real. When you do these distortions, you don't realize that you're fooling yourself and telling yourself things that are untrue. And again, we may have mentioned this in an earlier podcast, but the hopelessness is really the killer in depression,
right?
Because we can usually tolerate almost anything if we know it's going to come to an end. But when you tell yourself
it's going to be like this forever,
I'll be miserable forever, then that's when people turn to suicide. And it's such a tragedy because the hopelessness is one of the most gigantic hoaxes. Because it's impossible for depression not to change. Our emotions fluctuate constantly, but you just you can't see that when you're feeling depressed.
Now, let me ask you a question
Yeah.
there, because you say that, all feelings change, and of course it's true, but we do encounter people who've been depressed for weeks, sometimes months at a time,
Yeah.
and so it doesn't feel to them like it's changing.
No, absolutely. And furthermore, it functions as a self-fulfilling prophecy, too.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you tell yourself, this is hopeless, you'll give up.
Yeah.
And you'll stop doing your normal activities,
Yeah.
and then nothing changes. You stop working to get out of your depression, and then do nothingism is a huge cause of depression. So you get more and more depressed, and you say, sure enough, I really am hopeless.
Yeah.
But I've never had a depressed patient who couldn't recover if they stuck with it and chipped away at it. But it's a horrible feeling. The loss of self-esteem combined with hopelessness is just a very lonely and horrible place to be.
Yeah. Now, you say that all anxiety includes fortune telling.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure this is true, but I want to kind of quiz you a little bit on this,
sure.
because I've come across people sometimes who they just feel anxious. And if I ask them, well, what are you anxious about? They don't honestly have an answer to this. They say, I'm just feeling anxious.
Oh, yeah, that's real easy, actually. I'll give you an example of that. There's always thoughts. It's the short story, but I'll show you how to get at them.
Right.
I was treating a fellow who was some kind of financial advisor.
Yeah.
And he was doing well, and there was years ago, it was called Black Monday. I think there was some enormous 25% fall in a single day in the stock market.
Yeah.
And he had a feeling that was going to happen. And so the week before, he told all of his clients, sell all of your stocks this week. There's going to be something bad happen. Mm-hmm. And then sure enough, the crash came. And he looked like a genius. And then several weeks later, he said, I think the market's going to come back, and now is a good time to buy back in. And they did, and then the market zoomed up.
Gee, they must have loved him.
They loved him, but he became very depressed and anxious as a result of this. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what are the thoughts that are making you depressed and anxious? And he said, I don't know. I don't have any thoughts. I'm just depressed and worried and anxious, and I feel like something terrible is about to happen. I said, well, give me a moment that you were feeling anxious. Maybe we can get at your thoughts. He said, well, I was playing golf with one of my clients, and I was about to hit the ball, and I was just practically in a panic attack. And I said, what were you thinking? He said, I don't have thoughts. I just have feelings. I said, well, make up some thoughts. And I actually drew a little stick figure of a golfer, and I put a bubble above the head. And I just said, write some thoughts like you're a cartoonist.
Okay, yeah.
Just make up some thoughts so we'll know why this stick figure golfer is feeling anxious. Yeah. So I drew it, and then he wrote down, he says, well, he's telling himself, I'll probably when I hit the golf ball, I'll probably hook it into the lake. And he's also telling himself, my advice about the stock market was just luck. Yeah. And my clients think I'm much smarter than I am. Mm-hmm. And pretty soon they'll find out the truth about me. And then I'll lose my business. And then I'll end up bankrupt, and I'll end up a homeless person living on the streets. And I said, now would those thoughts make the stick figure golfer anxious? He says, oh, yes, absolutely. And I said, and I'm wondering if you were having thoughts like this. He says, oh, that's exactly what I was thinking.
So what did it take? You had to kind of like jog his memory.
Just kind of get him started, because sometimes as mental health professionals we use words that sound like jargon to our patients, so they don't know what we're talking about. Yeah. But I think there's always thoughts going on accompanying every emotion. You can't have a feeling without interpreting an event in some way or another. For example, I was just driving and I heard two gunshots, and I saw the flash too, and I got frightened. I said, oh my gosh, somebody's shooting. And then I realized it was some car with trick twin pipes that they could turn something on to make a fire come out and a bang. And then I reinterpreted it, even though that had been almost an automatic reaction. It was so fast. But there still was an interpretation. Oh my gosh, gunshots, I might get hit.
Isn't there some kind of innate, fear reaction, like very animal level, where we just get scared without even thinking?
Yeah, it's really automatic, and that's, I think, how animals survive. Our cat Obi, who was a feral cat, was living up in the woods behind our house before we adopted him, and he's fighting predators, and when he hears a loud sound, he jumps automatically, and that's his primitive brain telling him you're in danger, jump, get out of the way, and it keeps him alive. So some of these things are really hardwired, going in evolution back to simpler life forms. But it's still, the function there is it's telling you you're in danger.
Right, and maybe as human beings, what we do is we take that raw reaction and then we start creating a story about it, and that kind of amplifies it.
Yeah, that's another way of thinking about it, and a good one. Now, we could just touch base briefly on the positive distortions, although we're not going real heavily into that. But just as a reminder from last week, we're going through the 10 negative distortions, but there's a mirror image of 10 positive distortions.
Right, that's right.
And those positive distortions trigger not depression, but they trigger mania, narcissism, violence, aggression, conflicts between partners, husband and wife, conflicts between nations. They have devastating consequences as well. But one positive distortion is in the area of mind reading, where you're assuming wrongly that others are thinking positively about you, and you're not testing that, and it just makes you feel so good to think this that you think, how could I be wrong? And now we maybe shouldn't go too heavy on the political expressions of these things, but I know the previous administration, the Bush administration, that brought us in the war in Iraq, and I know my wife and I were out, on the streets in Palo Alto and San Francisco, protesting against that invasion. My wife saw that it was a mistake, more than I did, but I thought she was probably right. But in retrospect, she was so right. But Bush was saying that these people in Iraq, they want us to invade, they want democracy. They love us because we're invading, and they had this whole story about how popular we were in the Islamic world, and
we'll be the savior. What was it? Win the hearts and minds, or something like this.
And that they really wanted us there, and that they all loved us, and that would be positive mind reading, because that wasn't the way they were thinking at all. And then when they started to turn against us, they went into negative mind reading. That they hate us because they're jealous of our way of life. And that was just a story that they were making up. The real reason they were hating us was because we were in there invading their lands and bombing their homes and this type of thing. But I think the bottom line here is that both positive and negative distortions can get us into emotional trouble. The negative distortions, and the positive ones can get us into aggressive and conflicts with other people.
I remember a case study once where there was a woman who had a delusional disorder, and she thought that this particular doctor was in love with her, and she was just totally enthralled by his interest in her. And of course, she didn't have any, but she was interpreting all the little signs that showed that he was interested in her.
Exactly. And fortune telling, you also see, like in gambling, positive fortune telling. Instead of predicting something terrible, you say, I just know if I put all my money on number 32 on the roulette wheel or something, I'm going to make a fortune. Or I know when I put this quarter into the slot machine, I just know I'm going to hit the jackpot.
I think it's even at a more basic level with gamblers, even though they may have lost all their money that evening, say, well, I'm going to do better tomorrow. I know it.
Exactly. I'll win it all back.
I'll win it all back. Exactly.
Now, the next distortion is magnification and minimization, and I call this the binocular trick, where you blow things out of proportion, and you look, you magnify things, or you look through the other end of the binoculars, and everything gets real small. And a couple good examples of that are procrastination, and also you see this in overeating, binge eating, dieting problems. And procrastination, you're putting off something, and you start magnifying the task that you're putting off, and it's going to be so overwhelming, and it's going to take hours, and it's going to be so anxiety-provoking and so unpleasant.
Yeah.
And then
I do that.
Yes, I think we all do that. And then minimization is you say, oh, I've only got 20 minutes or 10 minutes. That would be a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
That wouldn't.
Yeah, I do that
count.
too.
Yeah.
You're describing me right here.
Yeah. And then in dieting, you get into magnification and minimization too, but that's, the positive distortion. Like I was downtown getting some bagels, thinking we might have a bagel after the recording, and there were these glazed donuts there.
Yeah.
And I couldn't tell if they were fresh or not, but they looked like they might be. I just love glazed donuts. I started telling myself, that would taste so good, and ooh, I can just imagine it in my mouth and how fantastic it's going to be. But fortunately, I resisted the temptation,
right.
And now I'm kind of glad I didn't eat it. And then
so that's the positive distortion,
positive magnification, and then
now tell me, how is that magnification? Because I'm sure that it's true that once you eat that donut, it's going to feel really good.
Well, it will taste good, but is it going to be as meaningful as what you're thinking?
Right. Okay.
I guess that could be a thing of debate. And then you can get into the minimization on dieting too. You can tell yourself, oh, I'll just have one little bite. One little bite can't hurt.
Oh yes.
But that's also discounting the negative, because how many times did you just have one little bite? You see, you've probably told yourself that 1,000 times, and it's never yet been true.
Yes, you have two positive distortions there.
Yeah. Right. Now, another really common distortion we're going to go over today is called emotional reasoning. How are we doing on time, by the way?
I think we'll have time to do this one distortion.
Okay. There's emotional reasoning is where you reason from how you feel. So you might say, I feel like a loser, so I must really be one. Or I feel anxious, therefore I must be in danger. Or I feel hopeless, therefore I am hopeless. Now, this is kind of a tricky thing, because a lot of forms of psychotherapy or human growth movement, whatever you want to call it, is kind of dedicated to that the secret of life is getting your feelings out, getting in touch with your feelings and believing your feelings. But in fact, and it is important to be in tune to your feelings and to be vulnerable and so forth, to have feelings in your relationships with others, positive and negative feelings, and to share them. But our emotions are created by our thoughts. That's the cognitive model. It's not what happens to us, but the way we interpret it. And if your thoughts are distorted, your emotions will not reflect reality any more than the curved mirrors in amusement parks that give this grotesque reflection of how you look.
That's where I get a little bit confused trying to explain that sometimes, because if I say to your client, so your thoughts create your emotion, but then I talk about emotional reasoning, where it sounds like it's just the opposite, where the emotion creates the thought. So where does this emotion come from?
I don't know how to answer the question of where emotions come from, because I think that science doesn't know an answer. You hear a lot of pseudo brain research things, on the media and lectures and things like that. But essentially, we don't yet know how the brain creates emotions. But I did a study in the Stanford Hospital on the causal linkages between negative thoughts and negative emotions when I was running the inpatient groups. Yeah. And we were recording patients' thoughts and feelings at the start and end of each group. And so I had data on about 125 patients. looking at the changes in their thoughts over time and the changes in their emotions over time. So I could look at the causal linkages. There was a huge causal effect of negative thoughts on feelings, just as the cognitive therapists have been claiming, and since ancient times that was confirmed. But the statistical model we were using indicated that there was also a reverse causal effect of negative emotions triggering more negative thoughts.
So,
and that's the emotional reasoning too. But it's also probably a neurologic basis that when you begin to get upset, it probably fires up those neural circuits where your negative thoughts are created and triggered.
Okay, so what you're saying is that there are times when we could experience negative emotions, but there's not necessarily a thought that precedes them.
No, I believe there's always a thought that precedes a negative emotion.
So in the case of emotional reasoning, what precedes the emotion that creates the reasoning?
That's kind of like the chicken and the egg problem,
okay.
I think, and I can't answer that. How our brain creates thoughts or even consciousness, to me, is one of the fantastic mysteries of science. And I guess it's kind of one of the Buddhist puzzles as well. But how can this inert fatty tissue in our head, it's just it's billions of neurons connected together, but how can that give rise to consciousness at all? To me, that's a fantastically interesting and puzzling phenomenon, perhaps beyond the scope of my understanding or this podcast, but it's a most interesting question.
Well, there was something else that you mentioned in the beginning of this distortion was you said, I feel like a loser, therefore I must be one.
Yeah.
But when I hear a client say things like, I feel like a loser, or I feel abandoned, I tend to redirect back to the fact that when you have the word like after the word feel, what comes afterwards typically is a judgment rather than an emotion.
That's a negative thought, yeah.
So,
but you might say, I feel worthless, I feel inadequate, I feel inferior, therefore I must be inferior. It must be true that I'm no good, I'm not as good as other people. It's a kind of perverse logic that we use, and it's like getting in the quicksand of depression, that your thoughts and feelings fuel each other like a snake eating its tail. And that's why it's so important that, we'll in a later podcast talk about how to change these things, but to use the daily mood log and to write down and record your feelings and how powerful they are, and then write down the negative thoughts that trigger them, because when you write them down one at a time, it becomes far easier to pinpoint the distortions in them and then to come up with positive thoughts that will challenge and essentially crush these distorted perceptions that create so much pain.
Okay. So how about the positive side of, positive distortion of emotional reasoning? What would that look like?
Well, I haven't thought about that before our podcast, but it would have to do with, I feel so confident that I just can't lose, something like that. And also in gambling, I feel like I'm going to make a ton of money. That's like positive fortune telling, but I feel like I'm a winner. Therefore, this is a good time to gamble money. You can also have the feeling that somebody really likes you when they don't. And I mentioned on a previous podcast many times that I've thought I had a fantastic therapy session, and then looked at the ratings of the patient afterwards and found out that the patient was not at all pleased with the session. And then you can deal with that the next week and repair that failure in the alliance. But just because you're feeling like somebody likes you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they do.
Maybe an extended version of that, or exaggerated version of that, might be when somebody experiences mania, where they have like those grandiose feelings, like nothing can stop them.
Yeah. I feel so confident. One of my patients experienced her first manic attack. She came for the treatment of depression, and I didn't know she had bipolar illness. She didn't either. She only had depressions.
Yeah.
And she was in downtown Philadelphia, and she saw the mayor at a press conference there in front of the city hall about something. And she had this feeling, I've got a new plan for world peace, and these people really want to hear what I have to say. And she ran up, she grabbed the microphone from the mayor and started shouting about her plans for world peace. And she was just shocked when she was arrested. And she didn't realize that she was in a manic episode. Unfortunately, rather than putting her in jail, they brought her for some emergency psychiatric treatment. Then she found her way back to my office eventually, and we were able to work together. Sure, but that would be powerful emotional reasoning, and how much pain that creates, even though it feels good.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all we have time for this podcast. So I think that in the next one we'll probably start with labeling. Is that right?
Yeah, labeling, should statements, and blame, and then I think we'll be done with all 10 distortions.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and we'll try again next time.
Okay, thanks, Reese.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donzel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.